Okay, so we're going to start looking at the definition of homelessness. When we look at numbers of people experiencing homelessness, it's first really important to look at how it is being defined because it varies depending on which organization you're looking at or which institution. And there's a major discrepancy between what the Department of Housing and Urban Development versus what McKinney-Vento, which would be the Department of Education, count as homelessness. So for HUD, they define homelessness as an individual or family who lacks a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. And this encompasses a lot, there's more detail that goes into this. So someone who has a primary nighttime residence, that's a public or private place that's not meant for human habitation. Someone who's living in a publicly or privately operated shelter that's meant for temporary living. So transitional housing or a hotel or a motel. And then finally, someone exiting an institution where they've resided for 90 days or less and who resided in an emergency shelter place not meant for human habitation before. So McKinney-Vento includes all of this definition, but they added this really important part, which is children and youth who are sharing the housing of other persons due to loss of housing, economic hardship, or a similar reason. And this is what is known as doubled up. And it's really important that McKinney-Vento includes these children because a lot of students that are living in Chicago are living doubled up. And if they were not to be included in this definition, they wouldn't have the access to these additional rights and resources that this act provides. So I shared the definitions with you, and now we're going to look how that reflects in the counts. So we can clearly see that there's a major difference between what HUD counts as experiencing homelessness versus what McKinney-Vento counts. So according to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, on a single night in 2018, 553,000 people were experiencing homelessness in the United States. And now the middle count here is we want to look specifically at because McKinney-Vento includes older children, like those that are in school. So we wanted to make sure to include those who wouldn't be in school and wouldn't be counted yet. So according to the US Department of Education, there was 1,455,537 children under 6 who experienced homelessness, which is around 6% of children under 6. And when we look at the age of children, or just the age in general of people in HUD shelters specifically, infancy is the most common age. So there are a lot of young children and infants that are experiencing homelessness. And then when we look over to the yellow circle at the McKinney-Vento numbers, there are 1,508,265 students experiencing homelessness in the US. And these are both for the 2017-2018 year. So for the number of children under 6 and the number of students experiencing homelessness, according to McKinney-Vento, there will be some overlap because when it comes to McKinney-Vento, some schools have preschool and some don't, and some include that in their McKinney-Vento counts and some don't. So there may be some children under the age of 6 in the yellow circle as well. But either way, we can clearly see that there are a lot of children experiencing homelessness, and specifically a lot of very young children. Okay, and then we're going to look specifically zooming in on the intersection of homelessness and race. So first, I wanted to look at this graph on the right here. So this is this is the United States, all the United States, looking at the general population by race and then looking at the homeless population by race. So if we look at the second bar here first under general population, clearly, white people account for well over half of the general population, around 75%, whereas African Americans account for around 13%. And then when we look at the bar above, specifically looking at the homeless population, we can see that there's like a major disparity there. So while African Americans only make up 13% of the general population, they make up around 40% of the homeless population. And then for white people, while they make up around 75% of the general population, they're only accounting for around 49% of those experiencing homelessness. And then if we look on the left-hand side of this screen, we're looking specifically now at Chicago and specifically at students. So we can see really how stark these disparities are. So in Chicago, there were 16,451 students that were experiencing homelessness. And of these students, over 98% of them were students of color, and 81% of these students are Black. And so we really wanted to look at why this is. And it really comes down to structural racism that leads to a disproportionate number of Black students experiencing homelessness. And there are a lot of different examples of this that we can look at. We could do a whole separate presentation only on this, but specifically just wanted to look right now at redlining, which, if any of you don't know what redlining is, it's a set of policies and practices that have led to disinvestment in Black communities and is a form of discrimination that has restricted where Black families can live. The act of redlining itself was literally on a map where banks would mark where Black communities were and low-income communities and wouldn't invest or give loans in these areas. And there are other practices that contributed to this. So restrictive covenants, or selling houses on contract so that the person never fully owned the house. And if they missed a payment, they could easily be evicted, which would again lead to homelessness. And redlining has lasting impacts on the communities that it affects. One of the number one ways for a family to accumulate wealth is through owning a home. However, Black communities were largely left out of this opportunity due to redlining practices, which means they're left out of major opportunity to accumulate wealth that could be passed down through generations. And this impacts entire communities. It's a cycle. When someone owns a home and the home is worth a lot, there will be more taxes collected. Therefore, the schools in those areas are going to be better funded and allow for students to have more resources and more opportunities. And we can see that redlining adversely affects, it affects the ability to accumulate wealth, it affects school opportunities, and it therefore also adversely affects the rate of homelessness in Black and Brown communities. And so now we're going to go on and look at the relationship between homelessness and trauma, and Alex Galvan will be speaking on that.
Hi, everyone. Thank you once again for being here with us. So again, this could be a whole training in and of itself, but we are trying to provide a really comprehensive overview of childhood homelessness. So please bear with me. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. But I just wanted to start off by giving a broad definition of what trauma is. So trauma is defined as a psychological, emotional response to an event or an experience that is deeply distressing or disturbing. Of course, this is just one definition, and it's important to remember that trauma impacts everyone differently. And so in saying that, it's important to remember that it's a very personal response, right? Two people can experience the same event very differently. So something that might be a trauma for me may not be a trauma for someone else based on our life experience, right? Also, reactions to trauma can be immediate or delayed. So maybe someone has experienced a traumatic event in their past and really hasn't felt the effects of that until later, right? And that could be brought on by a variety of things, or what I would call triggers. Responses also might differ in severities and might include a wide range of behaviors and responses. So someone might present, their trauma might really present in a way that causes them to be very closed off. For other folks, it might cause them to be, to have outbursts, for example. And so trauma is very difficult to detect because it doesn't look the same for everyone, right? Also, I wanted to include some factors that may make people more sensitive to trauma. And then the inverse would be factors that would make folks more resilient in dealing with trauma. So having direct involvement in the trauma, especially as a victim, so it happened to you. Having severe or prolonged exposure to the event. So poverty, for example, is something that can be a trauma, and the exposure is over time and prolonged, or community violence. Having a personal history or of prior trauma, or even generational and intergenerational trauma, which again is a whole nother thing we could go over, but all that to say that something that may have happened to your grandparents might impact you. And I would say redlining is an example of how structural violence can show up in the form of trauma for folks. Having a family or personal history of mental illness or severe behavioral problems, having limited social support or lack of caring family and friends. I would say this is where HOPES really tries to support our students in providing social and academic support. And then having ongoing life stressors, such as moving to a new home, a new school, or becoming homeless, right? Next slide. Okay, so here we'll talk about the relationship between homelessness and trauma. So it's important to remember that homelessness in and of itself typically results from extreme poverty and a lack of a social safety net or social supports, right? So even before we look at the trauma of homelessness, it's important that we think about all the things that someone may have experienced. Sorry, it's kind of windy. Before we see them in a shelter setting. Also, lack of affordable housing is something that contributes to homelessness, as well as decreased government support. And then that person's potential fractured social support, etc. Also important to remember, this doesn't mean that, folks don't have people around them that want to help, but simply that those around them might also not be able to help. And then also, I do want to mention that homelessness really is about loss, right? It results in a lot of loss. So not just loss of your house, but also loss of your community, loss of your routine, loss of privacy and security potentially. So there's a lot more that's happening there than just, we've been moved to a shelter, or we're living doubled up. And it really increases uncertainty, especially for children, right? Children are often kind of at the mercy of what their parents or their adult or their caregiver sets for them, right? So kids don't get to decide where they live, for example. But homelessness increases this uncertainty, right? Especially if families are jumping from house to house or shelter to shelter. For a child, this can really bring up feelings of, I don't know what's going to happen next. And that can be really anxiety inducing. Children experiencing homelessness are also more likely to get sick, mostly due to crowded living environments, lack of access to affordable healthcare. I think COVID has really highlighted the way that this disparity persists amongst the population. Students experiencing homelessness are also more likely to repeat a grade or fall behind. I would say the more likely situation is that they fall behind rather than repeat a grade. And studies show that every time a student is moved to a new school, that they can fall behind about 3 months. So if you're at 3 different schools over the school year, you can imagine, how difficult that would be. And I would also like to point out that it's not just like the student's not able to do the work, right? Like when you get a new job or something, you're always adjusting to the culture. What are the rules here? The school curriculum might be different. And you have all of this going on at home, right? You're dealing with homelessness, other traumas that you may have endured before that experience. So that contributes to it as well. Students experiencing homelessness are more likely to experience anxiety and depression and more likely to have PTSD. So for a long time, PTSD was thought of something that only veterans had, right? And as more researchers are looking into it, they're finding that, PTSD is not reserved for one population, right? Children who may be experiencing that prolonged trauma or toxic stress are also at risk for PTSD. And then here I just have Maslow's hierarchy as a reminder of how difficult it can be to meet some of these needs on top if you don't have your basic physiological needs met. Not to say that, anyone who doesn't have their basic needs met can't meet these top things, but they just might not necessarily be top priority, right? Awesome. Okay, here we are going to watch a short video that shows the impact of trauma on the brain. Whenever I talk about the brain, I also like to talk about neuroplasticity, which is your brain's ability to literally rewire itself, because it's important to remember that, trauma is not a death sentence. It doesn't mean things are going to be changed permanently. It just means that it can change the structure of your brain. And there are lots of tools and supports that you can provide someone who's experienced trauma to help kind of rewire those things. So go ahead and press play.
brain develops from the bottom up. The first thing to develop is the brainstem, or the reptilian brain as some people might call it. This area is responsible for our bodily functions. It tells us when to regulate our temperature, when to sleep, and when to eat. The next important part of our brains to develop is the limbic system, or what some people might call the mammalian part of the brain. The limbic system supports a variety of functions including emotion, behaviour, motivation, and long-term memory. The next part of the brain to develop is the cortex, which is the outer layer of the brain. This is sometimes considered the human part because humans are one of the only mammals that develop this part of the brain. This part of the brain is responsible for how we as humans were able to develop language, have thoughts, self-awareness, perception, and consciousness. Also, the cortex plays a key role in integrating the central nervous system and functions of memory. The last and most advanced part of the brain to develop is the prefrontal cortex, which is considered the executive functioning part of the brain. For some people, this part doesn't fully develop until they're in their mid to late 20s. The prefrontal cortex helps us to think through cause and effect, the ability to plan for the future, set goals, and understand the consequences of our actions. It's also responsible for the ability to moderate social behaviour. When we're in a stressful situation, part of our limbic system called the amygdala sets off an alarm bell response to let us know we're in danger and we need to do something about it. When this happens, the brain floods with a hormone called cortisol, so the body knows that something needs to be done. The most common responses to a stressful or dangerous situation are some you might be familiar with: fight, flight, freeze, or submit. This is an inbuilt system of survival to keep us safe when we're in danger. Like when our ancestors might have had to decide whether to stand their ground and fight against a large predator or run away. A stress response is a healthy, normal part of being a human. It lets us know that our bodies are working and keeping us safe. If a person is exposed to a highly stressful or traumatic event, or they have continual exposure to stressful events like abuse or neglect, their alarm system might become overactive. It might be always switched on, as if there was a risk of danger or threat at all times. For a child, this might affect how their brain develops. This is especially the case if it's in the context of stress or trauma events by a primary caregiver. In these cases, the child might develop an understanding of the world as an unsafe and dangerous place, even when they are in a safe situation. Sometimes this is called hypervigilance. It means being on edge or aware of danger at all times. Being exposed to stressful and traumatic events on a regular basis can also have a significant impact on neural connections in the memory center. It can even change the way we remember actual events. People use alcohol and other drugs for a variety of reasons.
Okay, so we will stop there and just continue to the next slide. Awesome. So really quickly, want to talk about the impact of trauma in the learning environment. I like that the video touches on different aspects of the brain that can be impacted by trauma, specifically the prefrontal cortex, which impacts executive functioning, which is a lot of what we're trying to teach students when we're working with them in a school setting, right? Like use your planner, stay organized, get things done. That takes time to learn for sure. So this slide really highlights what parents or teachers might observe in a student who has recently experienced trauma or is experiencing ongoing, perhaps compounded trauma. So re-experiencing, maybe thinking about the event, playing it over in their mind, or nightmares. These are things that, you wouldn't really know unless you ask. So they might come out in the form of drawings or play. Play therapy is a really great tool for working with young children who have experienced trauma. Avoidance, so avoiding places, engagement, maybe certain people, trying not to think about something, negative cognitions and moods. I think this is one which we'll talk about on the next slide that can often have students be labeled as moody or not very enjoyable, and kind of, misread instead of coming from a trauma-informed perspective. And then arousal. So being on edge, being on the lookout, kind of how that video mentioned, hypervigilance, right? Like always assuming that there is danger and wanting to protect yourself because that's your brain's job. And so this can really impact a student's ability to learn. So imagine trying to learn math and these intrusive thoughts are coming up, right? That can be really difficult. Or worrying about, where you're going to sleep at night or what you're going to eat for dinner. Those can be also some of the things that not just students experiencing homelessness, but students experiencing poverty might come up for them as well. Exposure to violent and other traumatic events can also disrupt a youth's ability to manage their emotions. And then, of course, long-term exposure is really important to remember as well. Go to the next slide. This slide just kind of shows in a different way how things might come up for a student who has experienced trauma and like what you might observe as someone who's working with a child. So like I said, worrying, maybe more clingy. So like really not wanting to let go of their parent or the teacher, increased distress. So maybe irritable, moody, whiny, a little bit more than typical. Decreased attention or concentration. So kind of checking out or dissociating. Angry outbursts or aggression. Absenteeism is can be a very big indicator that something is going on. Distrust of others. Increased somatic complaints. I think this happens a lot, especially with younger children who might not have the language to say, X, Y, and Z happened, or I'm frustrated. So it might come in the form of, my head hurts, my stomach hurts, overreacting to minor bumps and bruises, and then difficult authority, redirection, or criticism. So remembering that a lot of this has to do with loss, and one of those things is loss of power. And so wanting to kind of regain that power or assert themselves and their agency when possible. And then I included this graphic just because I wanted to highlight that students who come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are suspended at higher rates. And so if we know that there is a relationship between poverty and trauma, we can assume that there, is also some relation between how trauma is being read or received, and how that is leading to school suspensions and expulsion. So essentially, students who might be experiencing trauma and are likely experiencing trauma are perhaps being suspended at disproportionate rates. And so from an educator's perspective, really important to look at what might be perceived as deviant behavior with a trauma-informed perspective, right? So instead of saying, what's wrong with you? Really asking, what happened to you? And taking it from that point of view. Okay, and just the last thing I want to highlight is that the relationship between homelessness and education is cyclical, right? So experiencing homelessness has an impact on education in that youth who experience homelessness are less likely to enroll in a four-year college, according to this study. And, oh shoot, I'm totally blanking on what I was gonna say. So students who experience homelessness are at risk for low educational attainment, and folks who have lower educational attainment are at an increased risk for experiencing homelessness, right? So you can see how kind of this cycle may persist in this study specifically as it's related to four-year colleges. And then finally, some best practices. So, and I would say these are best practices for working with all students, not just students that you may assume are experiencing trauma. Building connected relationships with students is really important. Setting really clear boundaries and expectations, and then supporting students into success. So, we don't ever want to say, a student is experiencing X, Y, and Z, and so they just can't do this. They don't have to do this. If that's what's best for them, then of course, but really making sure that you're meeting students where they're at and you're setting really clear expectations and helping them to get there in a way that is best for them. Also aiming for restorative practices rather than punitive, creating predictability when possible. So you can see in our example of our classroom, our e-classroom, we have a daily schedule so students know exactly what to expect And they usually are the ones that they're like, it's 5:30, we're supposed to be doing X, Y, and Z, which is great. Honoring a student's emotions and need for space while also getting their systems to calm in a safe way. So maybe practicing some breathing. We have chill zones at our programs. And then also taking care of yourself. If you are new or have not heard of vicarious trauma or secondhand trauma, I highly recommend that you look into it, or perhaps we could do a training, because it is really hard to pour from an empty cup. And so in working with, I would say, any people in general, it's really important to take care of yourself as well.
All right, so with Hopes being a literacy program, we want to make sure we highlight the educational rights of our students experiencing homelessness, as well as low socioeconomic students. So with that, as a result of the McKinney-Vento Act, we have a program here in Chicago through the Chicago Public Schools, is the Students in Temporary Living Situations program, in which this program serves children and youths with grades pre-kindergarten through 12th grade that are experiencing homelessness, as well as low socioeconomic students. And with this program, we are able to have many different barriers broken down. One of the barriers being school fees. So as we know, school fees can be a lot. They can accumulate for anyone, but especially for our families experiencing homelessness, we want to make sure that we remove these barriers of fees. So with that, we are having all school-related fees removed, as well as low-income students are eligible for fee waivers, and all students are eligible for free and reduced lunch programs. So some of these fees can include for field trips, uniforms, graduation fees, school records, all of these things that accompany going and registering for school and during matriculation of school. We want to make sure that these programs and all these fees are paid for. The next is school choice and immediate enrollment. So we know that on average, students who transfer 2 or more schools throughout the school year fall behind an entire academic year. So in order to ensure that that doesn't happen, we have 2 options through the students living in temporary situations. The first is school of origin. By keeping a student in their school of origin, which can fall under 2 options as well, which includes students being able to stay in school that they were previously enrolled in, as well as the school when they were in permanent residence, the school that they attended. That will also help to increase academic benefits. There's also the option of a student attending a school nearest to their current residence. So the best way to kind of explain this is through a neighborhood example. So if a student is from the Chatham neighborhood and they attended Simeon, but they unfortunately, due to experiencing homelessness, they maybe had to relocate to Rogers Park, they still are able to attend school within the Chatham neighborhood. Similarly, let's say the student relocates from Chatham to Rogers Park, now to the Austin neighborhood. That student now is eligible to attend school within Rogers Park, or they have the option of attending school within the Austin neighborhood. So these are just ways to make sure our students are getting the most academic benefits. The next right is immediate enrollment. So we don't want to have a barrier of a student having to delay their enrollment if they have to transfer schools. So with that, students are able to attend class and fully participate in school activities, regardless of school registration and the records that are normally needed for enrollment. We don't allow that to be a delay in them attending school. There's also breaking down a barrier for undocumented students. It is illegal for schools to inquire about immigration status or request immigration documents, and these students are covered by the Act. And our next right is transportation. So as previously mentioned with school choice, if a student does decide to continue to attend the school they were previously enrolled in, we are also ensuring that transportation is provided as well. So Chicago Public Schools will provide transportation to and from school of origin, including all school-related activities. So if a student is in sports, clubs, there may be a meeting or things like that, they will be able to have transportation for all of those needs. They are also provided if lack of transportation is a barrier to attendance, enrollment, and success in school. Preschool students with disabilities qualify for transportation services as well. And there are two ways that transportation is provided. The first is through CTA for 7th through 12th graders, so like middle school all the way to the end of high school. These students will receive venture cards for CTA transportation. But if students are in 6th grade or below, these students and their parents or primary caregiver will receive venture cards. There's the second option of a yellow school bus. So if a parent is unable to accompany their student 6th grade and below, a yellow school bus can be arranged, and that's definitely for safety reasons. We want to make sure a child isn't getting lost in transportation or anything bad happens. And finally, we have our rights of removing barriers. So barriers must be removed that prevent students from receiving appropriate credit for full or partial coursework. So in order to remove that barrier, there is free after-school tutoring offered. Another option is the Chicago Connected, which is another initiative through Chicago Public Schools to connect families to internet and laptops. As we can see within the virtual world and with the COVID-19 pandemic, all across the nation and the world, students had to begin virtual learning. And with that, we see that all families in STLS are eligible for free internet or hotspots, as well as here at Hopes, we have been able to provide all of our students we service in shelters with hotspots, tablets, Chromebooks as well. I said Wi-Fi hotspots, but we are able to give that to our students to be able to not only participate in our program, but to succeed during their regular school day. And here we have some additional resources and ways you can get involved. I'm going to pass it to Clarissa.
Yeah, so these, if you want to look into any more of any of the topics, I know Alex G had also dropped a link in the chat on an article. And in the bottom right-hand corner, you can scan with your phone to sign up for our monthly newsletter. We usually have, if there's any events like this, we include them in there. We'll also have updates on stuff that's happening in Chicago, like with the hotspots or with the PEBT that's coming out. So it's a good way to keep up with what's happening at Hopes and also to keep an eye out for these other events that are going to be happening.